Walter drove his shoulder into the utility door hard enough to split the jamb. Then he stepped into my kitchen and put a packet of papers beside my daughter's breakfast. "Sign this, Joanna. Then we can work out when you leave." My husband had been dead for 22 days. His father had not come to ask how we were doing. He wanted my signature, my house, and apparently the courtesy of being heard before I called anyone about the door. Elise stood up so quickly her chair struck the wall. She was 18, old enough to understand what he was demanding, and young enough that she still looked at her grandfather as though he might explain it differently. Behind him, Paul's brother Evan held the broken door open. "Dad," he said, but he didn't pull him back. I moved to the end of the kitchen table, putting it between Walter and me. The back exit was clear. "Elise, outside. Take your phone." She looked at the papers. "Now, honey." Walter reached for the packet, as if he meant to hand it to her instead. I shifted sideways, keeping his attention on me. "She's not part of this." "This is family business." "You broke my door!" "It wouldn't open." "I hadn't opened it for you." He had knocked twice. I had called through the utility room that I wasn't receiving visitors. That was all it took for a man who had known me since I was 18 to decide the answer did not apply to him. Elise went out through the back. I heard the screen close, then reached for my phone on the counter. Walter's eyes followed my hand. "There's no need for that." I gave the emergency operator my address in Virginia Beach and said 2 relatives had forced their way into my home. I described where they were. I didn't call it a misunderstanding. I didn't offer the history of our family before saying what had happened. Evan let go of the door. "Joanna, come on. We can talk." "You can leave." Walter tapped the top page with one thick finger. "Your husband understood his responsibilities." For a moment that worked. Not because I believed him, because he said, "your husband," and I had spent 3 weeks catching myself about to call Paul. I had bought the coffee he liked. I had moved his shoes out of the hall and put them back because the empty space looked wrong. Hearing someone use his name in an ordinary argument felt almost like having him in the next room. Walter saw the hesitation. "Read it before you make this ugly." The operator asked whether either man had a weapon. I answered what I knew. No weapon visible. I kept the line open. Evan stepped into the utility room and said, "Dad, we're leaving." This time he took his father's arm. Walter shook him off, but he moved toward the door. "The papers stay," he told me. I didn't answer. I was watching his hands and the narrow space between his body and the table. He was 68, not helpless, and I didn't need to prove I could move him. I needed both men outside and my daughter safe. They went down the side path, their car doors closed. I watched the car leave before I went to Elise. She was standing near the back fence with her phone pressed against her chest. "Did he hurt you?" I asked. She shook her head. "Did he hurt you?" "No." She glanced toward the kitchen. "Can he make us go?" I wanted to say no immediately. I wanted to put something solid under her feet. But I hadn't read the papers, and pretending certainty had never helped me make a good decision. "He can't make us decide anything like this," I said. "Come sit where we can see the street." We waited for the officers on the back steps. Only after they arrived did I photograph the splintered wood, the loose strike plate, the packet on the table. One photograph included Elise's cereal bowl. I nearly moved it out of the frame. Then I left it. This was the kitchen he had entered. This was the morning he had interrupted. At the top of the first page, under my full name, was a line for a signature. Near the bottom was a reference to listing the residence for sale. Walter had spoken as if the house were already his to give or take. So why did he need me to agree? The officer who took my statement asked whether Walter had ever lived in the house. No. Does he have a key? No. Has he claimed ownership before? Not to me. He wrote down my answers. He photographed the jam himself and asked me to describe the knocking, the sound of the wood breaking, and where everyone had stood. Elise gave her own account. I stayed close enough that she could see me, but didn't fill in her sentences. When she said Evan had held the door, she looked embarrassed. The officer waited. He didn't break it, she added. But he held it open? Yes. He wrote that down too. I understood the impulse to make the details smaller. Evan had helped her learn to ride a bicycle. He brought her the wrong candy every Christmas because he remembered what she liked at 7 and never updated the information. It was difficult to place that uncle in the same sentence as the man who had stood behind Walter that morning. Both were true. We would have to get used to that. The officers did not examine the deed and announce a winner. They gave me information about the incident report and told me to call if either man returned and I felt threatened. I asked what would happen next and was told the account and evidence would be reviewed. There were no promises about charges. After they left, I took the packet from the table and put it in a clean folder. Then I called Grant Foster. He had known me through my service and he lived about 20 minutes away. Since Paul's funeral, he had offered groceries, rides, and help with anything heavy. I had refused all three, partly because I didn't need them, and partly because accepting help made the situation feel permanent. "Can you drive me somewhere this afternoon?" I asked. "Of course. What's happened?" I told him about the door. He asked whether we were safe now, whether the police had come, and whether I wanted him to bring anything. A screwdriver, maybe? I'm bringing lunch, too. He didn't ask whether I had put Walter on the floor. He knew me well enough to understand that getting a person out without someone being injured could be the whole point. While we waited, I called Beth Carter, the lawyer I had hired to help me deal with Paul's estate. Until then, our conversations had been about certificates, accounts, and appointments I kept writing on scraps of paper. I described the packet. "Have you signed anything?" she asked. "No." "Good. Send me photographs of the pages. Bring the originals when you come." "Can he have a claim on the house?" "Let's look at the documents before we answer that." It wasn't the reassurance I wanted, it was the response I trusted. Grant arrived with sandwiches and stood in the utility room looking at the split wood. "This needs more than a screwdriver." I figured. He found a local repair company with an opening that afternoon. I made the call myself, explained that I needed the doorway secured, and asked for the estimate in writing. There was a time when I would have called Paul and let him arrange it. He knew who answered, who showed up, who charged twice because a small job annoyed them. He had been good at making practical trouble disappear. I reached for my phone before remembering that I couldn't. Grant saw it happen and handed me the repair company's number again, without saying anything. At Beth's office, I put 3 things on her desk: Walter's packet, the documents from our house closing, and the mortgage statement. She read for several minutes. Paul and I had bought the house in 2022. The deed named us as husband and wife, tenants by the entirety, with survivorship language. Beth explained what that meant in our circumstances. Then she checked the other papers. "Did Walter contribute to the purchase as an owner?" "No." "Guarantee the mortgage?" "No." "Did either of you give his company an interest in the property?" "Not that I know of. I haven't." She turned Walter's packet toward me. "Nothing he's given you establishes a present right to take possession or order a sale. This is asking you to make an agreement." I looked again at the signature line. "He told me I had to leave. He has told you several things. We need to distinguish what he says from what these documents show." I asked about any debt Paul might have owed. "That would need its own supporting basis," she said. "An asserted business claim against an estate and a new personal promise from you are different matters." She did not tell me every debt vanished when a spouse died. She didn't tell me the house could never be affected by any financial problem. She pointed to the mortgage statement and reminded me to keep the ordinary payments current. For that afternoon, the important fact was narrower. Walter had not shown a right to make me leave. When Grant drove me home, I repeated it to myself without making it bigger. The repairman was still working. Elise had moved her cereal bowl and wiped the table. She had also put the packet's abandoned envelope beside my folder. "What did the lawyer say?" "We're not packing." Her shoulders dropped. "What about the money?" "I'll handle that." She stared at me. "Mom, I was there." "I know." "So I already know there's something to handle." I was tired enough that the reasonable question irritated me. I told her I needed to get through one thing at a time. She went upstairs, and I stayed in the kitchen putting the repair estimate in my folder. That evening, I offered to arrange somewhere else for her to stay until she felt comfortable. "Are you staying?" she asked. "Yes." "Then I want to stay." I didn't tell her she had to be brave. I showed her how the repaired door closed, gave her the incident report information, and said she could change her mind. After dinner, she asked whether I wanted company while I read the packet. I said not tonight. I thought I was sparing her. In fact, I was making decisions about what she could bear without asking her. It was a habit I would have to recognize before this was over. The amount was $42,800. I read it once in the heading and again where Walter's proposed agreement referred to it as an outstanding balance. There were spaces for installment dates. A later paragraph said that if I couldn't make the payments, I would agree to list the residence for sale. No one had signed it. The pages did not explain how Paul had incurred the alleged debt. There was no loan agreement attached, no note in Paul's handwriting, no description of what the money had purchased. Just a total and a proposed way for me to pay it. I made a copy, wrote questions on a separate sheet, and began with the simplest one. What was this money? On Sunday, 2 days after the intrusion, Evan called. I let the call go to voicemail. He left a message saying his father wanted to discuss a reasonable schedule. I sent back a text. "Send me the transactions and the reason you say they were loans. Do not come to the house." He called again. This time I answered because I wanted to know whether he understood the last sentence. "I won't come over," he said. "Neither will your father. I can't tell him what to do. You can tell him he isn't invited." There was a pause. Then he said, "He's under pressure." I waited. "The company's credit line is up for review. They want updated accounts and a plan for cash coming in. Dad thinks getting this settled would help." "He wants a signed schedule he can include as expected payments in that plan," Evan added. "That doesn't mean the bank has accepted it." "Did the bank tell him to get money from me?" "No, that's not what I said." "Then don't say it as though I have a deadline from the bank." He exhaled into the phone. I knew enough about Walter's business to understand the broad shape of it. He managed rental properties for other owners. He collected fees, organized maintenance, and spent much of his time complaining that owners wanted repairs done yesterday but took their time approving the bills. He also spoke of every building as though it belonged to him. My buildings, my tenants, my roofs. Paul used to correct him when we were younger. By the time we bought our house, he had stopped. His mother, Ruth, had died in 2021. Afterward, Paul seemed even less willing to leave his father disappointed. He would tell me Walter had already lost enough, usually while putting his shoes on to deal with a problem at one of the rentals. I understood wanting to help a grieving parent. What I couldn't accept was that helping had become the answer before we discussed what it would cost our household. During the last 2 years, Paul had worked part-time coordinating repairs for the business. He called vendors, collected estimates and invoices, and made sure an approved job didn't sit unfinished because 2 people assumed the other had made the appointment. He wasn't a contractor. He wasn't an owner. He was Walter's dependable son, with a phone full of people who would answer him. It suited parts of his life. Elise was older, the hours were flexible enough that he could drive her to things, and he liked being useful. When I was away, he had managed most of the daily business of our household. Solving other people's practical problems had become second nature. What bothered me was the way work for his father spread. A call during dinner became a trip across town. A trip became an evening. An evening became an argument about why I was keeping track. "He's paying you for this?" I had asked more than once. "Joe, it's handled." That was not always an answer. Evan said the transfers had come from the company account into ours. "All three?" "That's what Dad has." "What does the company ledger say?" "I don't do the ledger." "Who does?" "The outside bookkeeper. The office manager handles payments." "And what have they said?" "I don't know." I put my pen down. He was asking me to pay more than $40,000, and he hadn't asked the people who recorded the money what it was. "Then start there." "Dad thinks we should be able to resolve this ourselves." "He broke a door to resolve it himself." "I told him to leave." "After you held it open." He said nothing for several seconds. Then he told me he was sorry things had gone that far. I didn't accept that as an apology for what he had done. It described a situation as if the situation had moved on its own. "Does the company have a lawyer?" I asked. "They use someone for contracts." "Give that information to Beth." "We don't need everybody billing us." "You brought a document into my house asking me to sign a personal obligation. You don't get to decide whether I ask someone to read it." Evan said he would send what he could. After the call, I searched our household email for the name of Walter's company. Paul and I had used that address for years. School notices, warranties, repair appointments, insurance renewals. He sometimes used it for the part-time work because he was home when the invoices arrived. I remembered him saying an emergency job couldn't wait for the office to push a payment through. I remembered objecting to the word emergency being applied to everything Walter wanted. Paul had said the company reimbursed approved expenses. That was the procedure. An invoice went in, the office checked it, and the payment came back. I had assumed he meant smaller purchases, supplies, a deposit, something he could pay without moving the money we kept for our own emergencies. Now I wondered how much had happened inside the phrase, "It's handled." That afternoon, Walter sent me a message directly. "Your husband always understood that this family takes care of its obligations." I read it to the end, looking for a date, an amount, a description. There was nothing else. He had lost a son, I knew that. I had watched him stand beside Paul's coffin, with one hand on the lid, unable to bring himself to remove it. But grief did not explain why he thought my signature belonged to him. I forwarded the message to Beth and didn't reply. Later, when Elise came down to make a sandwich, she asked why I was looking at old bank statements. "I'm trying to understand something." "Something Grandpa said?" "Yes." "Do you think Dad borrowed it?" "I don't know." That was the first honest answer I had given her about the money. She stayed in the kitchen while I wrote down the things I needed, the 3 incoming transfers, whatever preceded them, and the messages attached to each job. I still didn't know whether Walter had misunderstood the records or decided not to understand them. I knew that he had selected a number before showing me a reason. And I understood the signature now. He did not have an agreement from me. He wanted one. The packet was supposed to turn his demand into something with my name beneath it, and the house was the thing he expected me to fear losing. Paul had often made his father's problems easier by absorbing the inconvenience himself. Walter was offering me the same position. Only this time the application came with a repayment schedule. On Monday morning, Evan sent 3 dates and 3 amounts. There were no descriptions. He said they were copied from the transfers Walter had selected. I downloaded our statements myself. I didn't use a screenshot of a screenshot or accept a list someone else had typed as the whole record. The first company deposit was $18,400 in February of 2024. The second was $12,700 in August of that year. The third was $11,700 in January of 2025. Together, they made Walter's total. I sat with those three numbers longer than I needed to. Our account had been joint. I had been able to open those statements all along. During my last years of service, Paul handled more of the household administration, but that didn't mean I lacked access. It meant I had trusted him to tell me about a decision large enough to affect our savings. Looking at the deposits alone, I thought he hadn't. Elise came into the kitchen carrying a laundry basket. Did you find it? Yes. Was it alone? I don't know yet. But you said you found... I found the money, Elise. That isn't the same thing. She lowered the basket. I heard how sharp I sounded and still kept going. I can't answer the same question while I'm trying to work. She left the basket by the stairs and went upstairs. For several minutes I was grateful for the quiet. Then I saw that she had left a pair of Paul's socks folded on top of the towels. She had found them in the dryer. I closed the laptop and went to her room. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. She was sitting on the floor with a pile of clothes beside her. I wasn't trying to bother you. I know. Are you mad at Dad? I sat on the edge of the bed. I might be. I don't understand what happened yet. Then why are you mad at me? That was a harder question, because the answer was so plain. Because you're here, I said, and he isn't. That's not fair to you. She picked at a loose thread on a shirt. I told her she could ask questions. I might not have an answer, and sometimes I would need a break, but I would say that instead of acting as though she had done something wrong. When I went downstairs, I made tea and looked at the statements again. This time I scrolled backward. 4 days before the first deposit, $18,400 had left our account. The recipient was a restoration company. I opened the household email and searched that company's name. The invoice came up in a message Paul had sent on February 13th. Cedar duplex, burst pipe, emergency restoration. Attached were the vendor's invoice and confirmation of Paul's payment the day before. His message asked the office to reimburse the approved expense. Underneath it was a reply from Evan. Received. Forwarded to the office. I read the outgoing payment, the request, and the incoming transfer in that order. Paul had paid the restoration company on February 12th. He had asked for reimbursement on the 13th. Money in the same amount had come from Walter's company on the 16th. That did not look like Paul borrowing $18,000 for our household. It looked like our household had carried a business expense for 4 days. I printed the statement pages and the email, leaving the dates and full message headers visible. Then I wrote one line on a clean sheet. Cedar. Money out before money in. For the August transfer, I followed the same steps. $12,700 went from our account to a heating and cooling contractor on August 19th. The invoice identified a replacement system at a property Paul called the Harbor Rental. He sent the expense request on August 20th. Evan replied that he had received and forwarded it. The company transfer arrived on August 23rd. Again, 4 days after our payment. The January job was a roof repair following storm damage at the Maple Rental. Paul paid $11,700 on January 13th, sent his request the next day, and received the matching transfer on the 17th. 3 jobs, 3 requests, 3 matching payments back. I had been looking at the right numbers in the wrong direction. For a moment, relief made me careless. I started an email to Evan. You knew what these were. I stopped before sending it. What did his replies actually say? Received, forwarded. They didn't say he had approved a payment. They didn't say he had checked a bank entry. They showed that he had handled requests connected to the jobs, which mattered, but it wasn't the same as proving he knew exactly what Walter was demanding now. I deleted the sentence. Instead, I wrote down another question for Beth. What does this establish, and what still needs checking? I wasn't an accountant. Knowing how to keep observations separate from assumptions didn't turn me into one. It did help me resist the satisfaction of deciding that every piece of the story now fit. There were still things I couldn't see. I didn't have the company's payment approvals. I didn't have its internal ledger. I didn't know what Walter had read before choosing these transfers. And the fact that these 3 deposits matched expenses didn't prove there had never been any other financial arrangement between father and son. It did mean he couldn't fairly ask me to accept his list without examining the transactions around it. I called Beth and described what I had. Send copies, she said. Keep the original downloads and the messages. Can I tell him he's wrong? You can tell him you dispute the claim and have records that need to be addressed. I laughed once, without much amusement. That sounds less satisfying. It's more useful. I sent her a simple comparison. Each row identified the property, the vendor payment, the request, and the company deposit. I kept the full supporting pages behind it. The payment requests had been sitting among appliance warranties and school notices in the email account I used every week. I could have opened them months earlier. That made what Paul had done harder to dismiss. If he had borrowed money without telling me, I could have been angry about a concealed debt. Instead, he had used our money to bridge his father's business expenses, then accepted repayment and treated the entire episode as if it had never happened. He had been reimbursed. That didn't mean he had been entitled to make the choice alone. I found a message from January in which he had told the office that the roofer couldn't wait until the following week. I can cover it today. Please put it through as soon as you can. There was no drama in the wording. That was how routine it had become. Paul had described a process for reimbursing approved emergency jobs through the office. He had treated it as a reason to make our account available when things were inconvenient. He must have expected the money back. He attached invoices and asked for repayment every time. But he also must have known I would object to our emergency fund serving as an extra operating account for his father. That was why "it's handled" had been easier than a conversation. When Elise came downstairs, I showed her the 3 rows. Dad paid for repairs first, I said. Then the company paid the same amounts back. So he wasn't borrowing? These records point to reimbursements. Beth wants the company to check its own records too. Elise leaned closer. Then why is Grandpa asking us? I don't know what he's looked at. She considered that. Are you still mad at Dad? Yes. Even saying it made my throat tighten. He shouldn't have used that much of our savings without talking to me. Getting it back doesn't change that. She nodded, then asked whether being angry meant I wanted her to stop talking about him. No, absolutely not. I told her about the afternoon he had put together her first bicycle and attached the front brake backward. He had insisted the instructions were unclear until she, at 7, pointed at the picture. She laughed. Then she cried a little, and I sat with her. The statement pages stayed on the other end of the table. I didn't have to choose between the man who had loved us and the man who had made a decision I resented. Paul had been both. My daughter needed room to remember him without worrying that every memory would become evidence. By Wednesday evening, Beth had reviewed the comparison. She said it gave us a concrete reason to challenge the demand and ask the company to reconcile the records. For the first time that week, I had a question Walter couldn't answer by telling me what a good son Paul had been. What expense exactly did he believe remained unpaid? Evan asked to meet the following afternoon. I agreed to a cafe near the shopping center, not the house. I told Beth where I was going and that I would not sign anything. He was already seated when I arrived. There were 2 coffees on the table. I didn't know what you wanted. I'll get my own. It was a small thing, but I wanted to begin without accepting something I hadn't asked for. He waited while I ordered. Dad's willing to be practical, he said when I sat down. Has he checked the transactions? He knows you dispute them. That wasn't my question. Evan rubbed the side of his cup. He might take half. Half of what he hasn't explained? 21,400, over 2 years. We could have the lawyers write it so nobody admits anything, and this particular claim is finished. Does he know you're offering that? He said he'd consider it. I'm trying to find something he'll accept. So it wasn't even a settled offer. It was an invitation to bargain over a debt I did not believe had been established. Still, I did the arithmetic. A little under $900 a month for 24 months. That was not a small payment. It would take money from repairs, from savings, from the cushion I wanted while I figured out how to run our household without Paul's income. But it was a number. After weeks of funeral expenses, account questions, and forms that seemed to produce other forms, a number had an appeal I was ashamed of. Evan saw me considering it. You don't want this dragging on. Lawyers cost money. Elise is starting college. Dad isn't going to change overnight. I looked through the window at a woman loading groceries into a car. She had put a bag on the roof and was searching for her keys. For several seconds, I wanted her problem instead of mine. What have you checked? I asked Evan. Joanna, not what your father told you. What have you checked yourself? He looked down. I remember Paul sending expense requests. There were a lot of jobs. I didn't handle the bank payments. I know. I don't know which transfers Dad pulled. You sent me the dates. I copied his list. I let that answer sit between us. He wasn't telling me he had proved a loan. He was telling me it might be cheaper to accept his father's version than to make him defend it. Would this require me to stop talking about what happened at the house? No, I'm not asking you to hide anything. Or sign something about the property? We'd have to see what the lawyers write. I'm talking about resolving the money. Then there isn't a complete proposal yet. No, he admitted. There isn't. I said I would think about what he had actually suggested, not the piece he was promising around it. On the drive home, I disliked myself for thinking about it at all. The evidence was in my folder. Why was I considering paying? Because evidence did not answer every practical question. It did not tell me what a prolonged dispute would cost, how many hours I would spend on it, or whether Walter would keep trying to reach us. It did not put Paul's income back into the household. I called Beth from the parked car outside my house. She didn't make me feel foolish. Sometimes people settle disputes for practical reasons, she said. But don't confuse a proposed settlement with proof that you owe the amount. Would fighting it cost more? I can't promise you what the total work will be. We can take the next step, evaluate the response, and decide how much further is necessary. She proposed beginning with a written request for the basis of the claim, accompanied at the appropriate point by our comparison. A measured next step, not an unlimited campaign. I don't want to spend Elise's future proving a point. Then we'll keep that concern in the decisions, but you don't have to sign today. Inside, Elise was at the table looking at the college's fall schedule. I told her Evan had suggested a reduced amount over 2 years. She picked up a pencil, put it down, and asked, Would that mean we couldn't fix the car if it breaks? It would mean less room. Is that why you're thinking about moving? I'm not making a decision about moving. You keep saying you aren't making decisions, but then you won't tell me what you're thinking. She was right again, and I was tired of being corrected by someone whose laundry I was still finding under the couch. I sat down. I want this finished. I don't know how expensive finished will be. She looked at the repaired utility door. If we pay him, can he still come back asking for something else? I explained that a written settlement could address this particular demand. It wouldn't necessarily answer every future argument in the family. She nodded. Then she asked whether her father had felt like this when he paid for those repairs. I hadn't thought of it that way. A bill. A deadline. Walter insisting the easiest answer was for someone else to carry the inconvenience. Paul had expected reimbursement. I would be agreeing not to get anything back. But I recognized the impulse to spend money so the next conversation would be easier. That evening, I wrote to Beth. I am not accepting Evan's proposal. Please ask for the complete basis of the claim. Before sending it, I looked at the folder again. I was not choosing an argument because I enjoyed being right. I was choosing to make the demand answerable to something other than Walter's persistence. I pressed send. Then, I told Elise what I had decided. Walter's written explanation arrived the next day. Beth forwarded it with a short note asking me to check it against the records, not answer it directly. He described the transfers as advances he believed remained repayable. He referred to helping Paul and to the family's long history of working things out without formalities. There was no loan document. The page was more careful than the packet he had brought into my kitchen, but one description caught my attention. The August payment was labeled as an advance for the harbor repair. I pulled the contractor's invoice and our statement. We had paid the contractor on August 19th. The company had transferred the matching amount on August 23rd. The money he described as an advance arrived 4 days after Paul had paid for the work. I read the dates aloud because I wanted to hear whether I was missing something. August 19th, August 23rd. That didn't settle every possible explanation. Someone could reimburse an expense and still have a separate claim for something else. But Walter had identified this transfer with this repair, and his description did not account for the sequence. I wrote to Beth. If this was an advance for harbor, why had Paul already paid the contractor? She called later. That's exactly the kind of question the supporting records should answer. Will he just change what he calls it? He might. We keep the explanation he's given and ask him to address the inconsistency. I kept Walter's explanation beside the invoice. Beth would ask him to address the dates, not claim they settled everything. Beth sent the comparison and supporting copies for a proposed meeting. She asked Walter to have the company's own records checked through its counsel. Walter wanted to meet first. According to his reply, paying people to examine what he called a family understanding was wasteful. He could explain it in person. I asked Beth whether we needed to agree. We can ask him to supply the records without a meeting, she said. If you do meet, it should have a defined purpose and it should not be at your home. I thought about it overnight. I didn't want to spend weeks exchanging vague statements. I also didn't want another afternoon in which Walter could speak over me in my own kitchen and tell me I was refusing to listen. I agreed to a meeting at Beth's office. The subject would be the 3 transfers and the basis of the demand. No signing on the day, no private discussion in the parking lot afterward. 2 days later, Evan sent Beth a message and copied me. He recognized the harbor job reference. He remembered forwarding the invoice. He could not confirm his father's description of the date without checking the office records. Evan wasn't confirming all 3 transactions, but he was no longer repeating his father's certainty. I added the message to the folder. Grant came by that weekend to help me move a box of Paul's tools from the hallway into the garage. He asked how the money question was going. There's a meeting. Do you want to ride? I can drive. That wasn't quite the question. I agreed to let him take me. He didn't ask to attend the meeting. He wasn't a witness to the payments and had no role in deciding them. I told Grant I was worried Walter would turn the meeting into an argument about Paul. He suggested keeping the payment question in front of me. I had spent 10 years in uniform, the last 5 serving with the SEAL team after the years of training and preparation that brought me there. I left the Navy in June of the previous year. My husband and daughter knew what that life had required. They had lived with the schedules and absences, not a mysterious version of me I kept in a drawer. Walter knew I had been in the Navy. He had never shown much interest in the particulars. To him, Paul's flexibility at home had been the real work, and my service had been something the family accommodated. I had let a great many remarks pass because Paul would be sitting beside me, already preparing to change the subject. None of my training told me how to stop missing him. It did give me a familiar task when I faced something difficult. Identify what I knew, identify what I didn't, prepare for the part I could influence. For this meeting, that meant papers I could explain and an exit I could take. Not an audience, not a threat. I made a smaller folder to carry with me. The original downloads and messages stayed backed up at home. Beth had copies. I marked the comparison so I could find the supporting page for each row without shuffling through everything. I left my notes about Walter's insults at home. The meeting was about the transfers. On Monday, Beth called to confirm the meeting for Wednesday morning, 12 days after Walter broke the door. "He still hasn't supplied a loan agreement," she said, "and the company records haven't been reconciled for us. So we may leave without an answer." Yes. I was grateful she said it before I walked into the room. That night, Elise asked what would happen if Walter refused to listen. "We'll leave with the same questions still requiring answers." "And if he gets angry?" "Beth will be there. I don't have to stay for that." Elise nodded, then asked me to text when it was over. I put that on my list. Not win, not make him apologize, text my daughter. Walter was wearing the suit he had worn to Paul's funeral. I noticed that before anything else, and for a second I hated him for it. Then I reminded myself it might simply be the suit he owned. Grief made it easy to assign intention to everything. I needed to be more careful than that. Evan sat beside him. Beth took the chair next to me and put the comparison between us. Walter looked toward the door. "Is anybody else joining us?" "No," I said. Grant was not in the building. He had dropped me off and gone for coffee. Beth explained why we were there. We would review the basis for the 3-payment demand and the documents already exchanged. There would be no agreement signed during the meeting. Walter leaned back. "I thought we were here to settle it." "We're here to understand what supports it," Beth said. I began with Cedar. Paul had paid the restoration company from our household account on February 12th. The expense request went to the office the following day. The same amount returned from the company on the 16th. I showed the invoice, the outgoing entry, and the incoming entry. Walter glanced at the bank statement. "I can see the company sent him money." "Yes, after he paid a company repair bill." "He paid a contractor." "The invoice identifies the Cedar duplex. The request asks for reimbursement for that job." I turned to Evan. "Is that your reply?" He looked at the printed message. "Yes." "What did you mean by received and forwarded?" "That I sent it to the office manager." "Did you approve the payment?" "No." Beth asked whether the office records had been checked to determine how the deposit had been recorded. "Not for this meeting," Walter said. "Works how money moved in this family." I moved to Harbor. The work was paid on August 19th. The company transfer followed on the 23rd. Walter's schedule called that transfer an advance for the repair. How could that money pay for a repair Paul had already paid 4 days earlier? Walter looked at Evan. Evan looked at the invoice. "It might have been settling something between us," Walter said. "What arrangement?" Beth asked. "Paul and I didn't write down every conversation." "Do you have a record supporting that explanation for this payment?" "I have the transfer." "And Joanna has the corresponding expense records. Those need to be reconciled." We went through Maple without repeating the whole argument. January 13th, money paid to the roofer. January 17th, the same amount paid back to our account. The request between them identified the repair and asked for reimbursement. Walter pushed the comparison a few inches away. "You're making this sound as though Paul was doing me a favor." "He was coordinating the company's repairs," I said, "and using our savings when a payment needed to go out." "He was paid for his work. That doesn't explain these transfers." For a moment, he seemed ready to begin again at Cedar. Instead, he asked Evan to tell us how often the company had helped Paul. Evan rubbed his thumb along the edge of the paper. "I can't say these were loans." Walter turned toward him. "You know what I'm talking about." "I know Paul sent these requests. I know I forwarded them. The amounts match what's here." "You didn't do the bookkeeping." "No, that's why somebody needs to check it." It wasn't a speech. Evan didn't stand up and renounce his father. He looked uncomfortable and spoke too quietly. But he stopped lending Walter certainty he didn't have. Walter turned back to me. "Your husband would never have put me through this." I felt the familiar pull of that sentence. Defend Paul, defend myself, explain every decision we had made in nearly 19 years of marriage. Instead, I put my hand on the unsigned packet. "I am not taking on this debt. I am not agreeing to list my house." He started to speak. "If the company has records supporting a claim, Beth can receive them, but I'm not signing this." Walter looked at the page beneath my hand. For all the language about responsibility, that was what he had come to obtain. He could continue arguing. He could insist he remembered things differently. He could ask the company to check its records. He could not leave with my agreement unless I gave it to him. Beth took over the questions about the next step. She asked for the company's counsel to coordinate a review of the expense packets and entries with the bookkeeper. The comparison would go to them, and further demands would come through her. Walter said he wanted the company to examine everything before anyone declared him wrong. "Then have it examined," Beth said. The demand still needed a written response. Evan had helped make that necessary, but I wasn't ready to speak with him alone. But Walter stood up with the packets still unsigned. As he reached the doorway, he said I had changed. I didn't answer. We had finished the question I came to address. Evan paused behind him. "I'll look at the office records." "Send what you find through counsel," Beth said. After they left, I sat for a moment while Beth put the papers back in order. "Was that enough?" I asked. "It was enough to make your position clear. We still need their response." I nodded. Outside, I texted Elise before I called Grant. "Meeting over. I didn't sign. Coming home." Her reply arrived while I was standing on the sidewalk. "Want me to make lunch?" I wrote yes. Then I put the phone away and waited for my ride. 3 days after the meeting, Evan called to say Walter would speak to me alone if I wanted to clear up the hard feelings. I was standing beside the washing machine with a basket against my hip. "About the money?" "About all of it." "Then he can contact Beth." "He thinks having lawyers between everybody makes it worse." I set the basket down. "Evan, I'm not having the same meeting without the person who helped keep it on the facts." I told him I'd ask. Now you've asked. I didn't argue about whether Walter meant well. I didn't offer another date or a different place. When Evan began explaining his father's week, I said I needed to go and ended the call. Then I sent Beth a brief account of it. I had expected keeping that boundary to feel decisive. Instead, I felt rude. I folded towels badly for 10 minutes and wondered whether I should have sounded kinder. The feeling passed without requiring me to make another call. In early August, the company's outside counsel contacted Beth. She sent the comparison, the supporting statement pages, and the expense emails through the agreed channel. I was not copied on every conversation between the company's lawyer and bookkeeper. Beth told me when information had been requested and when there was a response. I learned to ask what had actually arrived rather than what a delay might mean. For a week there was nothing substantive. I almost took that as proof they were hiding something. Beth reminded me that unanswered was not the same as disproved, and slow was not automatically dishonest. She followed up. I went to Elise's college orientation and left my phone in my bag for the first half hour. By mid-August, the company had located the underlying expense packets. The information came through counsel. It confirmed more than I could have established from our household records alone. The office manager had approved the Cedar reimbursement on February 15th. The payment went out the next day. The Harbor request was approved on August 22nd, with payment the following day. The Maple request was approved on January 16th and paid on the 17th. The bookkeeper's entries treated them as expense reimbursements through the clearing account, not loans to Paul. The jobs had been authorized repairs for properties the business managed. Paul had paid the vendors, submitted the documentation, and received the corresponding money from the company's operating account. The office had kept the invoices and approvals together. Once those records were placed beside the bank entries, the sequence was straightforward. There was a routine process that someone had chosen not to check before coming to my house. Beth called after reviewing the response. This supports the explanation we sent them. I asked the question I had been holding for weeks. Then why did Walter call them loans? The correspondence says he relied on the transfers and his understanding of prior family assistance. He hadn't reviewed these supporting packets. He could have. Yes. I sat down. That answer mattered more than any elaborate theory about his intentions. He could have asked. He could have had the office retrieve the records. He could have waited until someone checked whether the company was owed anything. Instead, he had brought an agreement to a grieving household and broken the door when I wouldn't receive him. Not knowing did not excuse deciding I should pay. Evan's written correction arrived separately through the same legal channel. He confirmed that he had received and forwarded the requests, but had not authorized the payments. He acknowledged that, after looking at the supporting office records, he could not support the description of those transfers as loans. There was another paragraph about the visit to the house. He said he had accompanied Walter, held the door after it was forced, and remained while Walter demanded a signature. He had urged his father to leave only after I made the call. I read that paragraph more slowly than the accounting explanation. It was the first description from him that contained actions instead of things getting out of hand. I didn't write back personally. Beth acknowledged receipt. The statement joined the other records. It didn't become an invitation. The company's lawyer recommended withdrawing the demand based on the matched records. Walter still had to authorize the response. He controlled the business. Counsel could advise him, not become its owner for an afternoon. That final step took longer than I wanted. During the 8th week after the intrusion, Beth forwarded the written withdrawal. The company would not pursue the demand based on those 3 transfers. She explained the scope. It addressed this specific claim. It did not close every estate matter, settle the door incident, or erase bills I had already paid. I read the letter standing at the kitchen counter. Then I sat and read it again. Elise was at college. Her first week of classes had begun, and I didn't want the message waiting for her to sound like an emergency. When she came home, I told her the company had withdrawn the money demand. All of it? These 3 payments, yes. Do we have to do anything? Keep the letter. She took off her backpack and asked whether we could have something other than leftovers for dinner. We ordered takeout. Neither of us made a speech. The mortgage payment still went out that month. So did Beth's bill. I had already paid to repair the doorway. I didn't receive a check that restored every hour I had spent on the dispute. A later message from Evan said the company would have to sort out its cash problem without counting on money from me. I didn't know what arrangements they made. I didn't ask for a report. The business wasn't mine to rescue or supervise. For a while, I had measured progress by what Walter could no longer do. Now I could stop checking for a message every time my phone vibrated. The folder stayed in the cabinet. It was still available if I needed it. For the first weekend since July, I didn't take it out. By September, Elise had learned which route to college was quickest, and which one was quickest only when nobody else had the same idea. She was commuting from home. 3 mornings a week she left before I finished my coffee, then came back with stories about an instructor who never started on time, and a parking lot designed, apparently, by someone who hated students. Those complaints were a relief. They were about her life. One evening she spread her course materials across the kitchen table and asked whether we were still going to live here after Christmas. I looked up too quickly. Why wouldn't we? She held a page between 2 fingers. I didn't say we shouldn't. I asked. I apologized and let her finish. Some classmates were sharing apartments closer to campus. She wasn't asking me to pay for that. She wondered whether a smaller place might cost us less, whether the commute would change, whether we wanted to keep maintaining a house with space we didn't use. I had an answer ready for Walter. I didn't have one ready for an ordinary question from my daughter. We just got through keeping it, I said. I know. I don't want to move because of him. Would moving next year mean it was because of him? I couldn't honestly say that it would. I had spent the summer defending my right to remain. Somewhere along the way, I had begun treating that right as a promise I had to keep forever, as if choosing differently later would let Walter rewrite what happened. Elise wasn't asking about winning. She was asking about a commute and a budget. We got a notebook and wrote down the costs we actually knew: mortgage, utilities, insurance, the repairs likely to come next, her transportation, what we could afford now, without counting on money we hadn't received or work I hadn't arranged. There were questions we couldn't answer that evening. We didn't invent figures to make a decision feel finished. We agreed to stay through the end of her first term in December and look at the numbers again. If staying made sense, we would stay. If a different home made sense, we would consider it. There was no listing agreement on the table, just our notes. A few days later, Evan asked whether he could stop by. He said he wanted to explain himself without his father there. I read the message while Elise was out. I thought about the correction he had provided and the cost, within his relationship with Walter, of refusing to support the loan story. I also thought about the door. I didn't need to deny the useful thing he had done in order to remember the harmful one. I wrote that I had received his correction and appreciated that he had accurately described his role. I wasn't ready for a visit, and he should not come to the house. He replied that he understood. I hoped he did. I didn't promise him a date when I would feel differently. For years, I had treated a request for another chance as if it were a deadline. Someone apologized, or almost apologized, and suddenly I was expected to show that I was generous enough to move on. This time I left the answer where it was. There were still practical estate matters to finish. Beth and I worked through them. I kept receipts, returned calls, and asked questions when I didn't understand a form. Walter didn't reappear at the door. He didn't apologize either, and I stopped waiting for an apology before making plans. His son had died. So had my husband. Those losses could exist beside the damage he had caused without one excusing the other. Near our wedding anniversary, Elise found a photograph from the first apartment Paul and I rented. We were sitting on the floor eating from takeout cartons because we hadn't bought a table yet. Paul had one sock on. I couldn't remember why. Elise asked whether she could keep a copy on her phone. Of course. Even after the money stuff? Yes, honey, even after that. I told her I was still learning how to be angry with someone I couldn't speak to. Sometimes I wanted to ask Paul what he had been thinking. Sometimes I wanted him to make the ordinary noise of coming in and setting his keys down. One feeling didn't cancel the other. She asked whether he would have been proud of how I handled Walter. I considered giving her the easy answer. Instead, I said, I think he would have wanted us safe. I also think he would have wanted the argument to stop before it got uncomfortable. She looked at the picture. That sounds like Dad. It did. He had been patient teaching her to drive, and evasive when I asked why his father's work kept taking our weekends. He had remembered how I liked my coffee, and failed to tell me when he was using our savings. He had loved us, and he had let a habit become a decision he didn't discuss. I wanted Elise to be allowed to remember a person, not maintain a flawless version of him for me. In early October, we cleaned the kitchen cabinet that had accumulated 3 months of papers. The withdrawal letter stayed with the records. The repair receipt stayed too. I kept what I might need without leaving the dispute spread across the room where we ate. Elise brought down a stack of college handouts. "Can these go here?" She pointed to the shelf we had just cleared. "Yes." She slid them in, then pulled one back out. She had an assignment due Monday and wanted to work at the table while I made dinner. I moved the notebook with our housing figures to the cabinet. "Leave that one," she said. "We still need it." She was right. We had another conversation scheduled for December, and more decisions after that. None of them had to be made that night. I set the notebook beside her books and asked whether she wanted rice or potatoes. "Potatoes. And can you look at this when I'm done?" "I can." She opened her laptop. I took 2 plates out of the cupboard and left space for them on the table.